Well, it's good to be back with you for another day of Bible study as we are continuing on through our Game On study. My name's Kevin Young. Have the have the privilege of serving as lead clergy here at Christ Table. If you'd like to know more about Christ Table, all you need to do is visit the URL that's right up there in the corner of the screen, www.christstable.today. If you'd like more information about this study in particular, then right there is where you need to go. go.christstable.today/game on. There's a downloadable PDF there, actually a couple of downloadable PDFs there that will help you navigate this series absolutely free. They'll give questions and deeper insights into the study. Also a youth and children's curriculum there to help you take this to family time or to help present it to younger people. You can get printed copies of those, very nicely bound color copies of that study material as well. If you want that, it helps us if you do that financially by making a donation. We send those resources absolutely free to those who are regular donors to Christ Table. But if you're not a regular donor to Christ Table, you can get the materials for free, or we also offer them as well printed to you to help us defray the cost of what we do here. And we appreciate those who take advantage of that, but we do want to offer as many things for free as we possibly can. So today our text is in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 22 and 22, just 22. And one of the things that I've been noticing is almost all of the verses that we've been using in this series are from Paul, which is really kind of fascinating because oftentimes we try to resist or avoid Paul because Paul can be very kind of traumatic or triggering for those who are experiencing trauma from church history, because Paul has been so taken out of context, so used in order to oppress and marginalize people, women, minorities, folks who are not believers or don't believe in the same way as certain individuals, who believe differently. And so one of the things that I like to do is try to actually kind of redeem Paul from the trash heap of fundamentalist evangelicalism and really try to focus in on the truth behind who Paul was and what Paul is trying to say. And so we've been doing that a little bit in this series, taking several pieces and parts of things that Paul has said and reframing them. Well, not really reframing them, but framing them correctly, and then reframing them in a way that kind of helps us understand this connection between chess and the spiritual life. So this week, our final week of our study, and we're halfway through our final week of our study, just a couple of more days left after today. And we are on that sixth and final piece of chess. We are talking about the king today, the piece that is perhaps the least powerful piece on the board, or at least is only marginally more powerful than the pawn, but is the most important piece on the board, because without the king, the game cannot continue. So as we've been talking about the king, several of the things that we have found out is that the king can only move one space at a time in any direction. And that means that the king has to rely on other individuals, other pieces in the game, oftentimes for its safety and security. So whenever we talk about the king or think about the king, it's fascinating that even the humblest pawn can save the king's life. I think, whenever you hold these two pieces up together, for those of you who have the spiritual formation box, you have both the king piece and you have the pawn. And it's just kind of amazing. I love that you can kind of tangibly hold these in your hands, because there is a weight difference, a significant weight difference between these two. And these are tournament level chess pieces. These aren't something you just can buy at Walmart. These are tournament level chess pieces, and they're weighted correctly. And there is a huge weight difference between these two. There's also, if I line them up here side by side, there's also an enormous height difference between these two. But as big, as powerful, as tall, as necessary as the king is to the game of chess, the king needs the pawn. The king needs the rook. The king needs the knight. The king needs the bishop. the king needs the queen, and the king needs the pawn. In fact, many times the pawn is the most critical piece on the board in order to protect the king. Many of the other pieces are strategically on offense, but many times the pawn is on defense, protecting the king and hanging with the king. And even the humblest pawn can oftentimes in a game be the difference between winning a game and losing the king's life. Another thing that I think is fascinating about the king is that the king's survival depends on all of the other pieces working together. They have to work together to protect the king. You always have to make sure that you understand where the king is, where the weak spots are in the king's position in relation to the rest of the board, especially the opposite player, your opponent's pieces. And every move that's made on the board, you have to rethink all of your strategy, and especially if you weren't expecting, the opponent to move in a way that they did. And this king's survival requires it to really rely on every other piece on the board working together in order to protect it by taking other pieces out or standing in the way, even oftentimes sacrificing their own lives. Many pawns sacrificing their life in a game for the king. So when I think about that, there is just so many parallels, at least should be so many parallels to what happens in life, in the Christian life, I would say, but also even just in life in general, is that we should be working together to protect, to sacrifice when necessary for other people, but also allowing ourselves to be protected and to allow ourselves to work with other people as well. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 22, Paul says, oh, no. On the contrary, as he's been making this argument against folks who say that, weaker individuals, weaker brothers, should be ignored, should be avoided. Paul says, on the contrary, whenever we think about parts of the body, you might think that some parts of the body are more important or more significant than other parts, like the head. Maybe the feet, maybe the hands are more significant than some other parts of the body. And Paul has taken to relating parts of the body to parts of the body of Christ, meaning the church. And so he kind of uses this analogy to say that the parts of the body all have to work together, just like in a community. All people have to work together and need to. And on the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are actually indispensable. There are parts of the body that oftentimes over the years, they had no idea what they were there for, what the need was. And so, they remove them. And then come to find out, these pieces and parts are important. They're there for a reason. You can't just take them out and not expect there to be a equal and opposite side effect or reaction to doing that. No part of your body truly is really indispensable. It's there for a reason, right? And I think what Paul is saying here is whenever we look at least the community of the church or the community of followers of Jesus, there may be individuals among that community that are weak, perhaps not necessarily physically weak, but spiritually weak. Maybe they're not as mature. Maybe they're rough around the edges. Maybe they're difficult personalities, and they may seem weaker. And so you might go after, if you're wanting people on your spiritual team or to be in your court, you might gravitate towards the pastor that's in the room, or you might gravitate towards the person who's very ostentatious and outgoing and really prays or talks about faith or religion and in a very kind of flowery way that is impressive. You might prefer to follow big name influencers because in your mind they are stronger, and people with small followings, or people who don't speak well, or people who don't have a degree or a position in the church attached to their name has no reason for you to listen to them. They're weak. They're indispensable. Shut your mouth, move on. Nobody's listening to you. And Paul says, no. On the contrary, those people who to you may seem dispensable, may seem weak, or may seem to not really have any position or authority to speak on behalf of the Spirit, or to speak on behalf of faith, or to speak into your life, Paul says, no. Whether you perceive that they are weak or whether they are truly weak doesn't matter. Everyone in the community of Christianity is indispensable. Whether you perceive them as being weak or whether they truly are weaker, Paul says it doesn't matter. Everybody in the community of Christ, in the community of faith, is indispensable. So as we kind of focus this in now on Christianity, just like, the pawn is indispensable to the king and the other pieces are indispensable to the king, those weaker individuals are also indispensable to the community of Christ. Christianity should be different. Christianity should look like that relationship in chess between the king and between the pawn, because Christianity emphasizes that healthy communities honor every person's contribution, no matter how big, no matter how small, no matter how significant, no matter how insignificant. Every person's contribution is honored, creating space for diverse gifts to flourish rather than expecting everyone to be the same. And we, I'm sure, have all been in religious contexts that expects everybody to be the same, to believe the same way, to practice in the same way, to live in the same way, to speak in the same way, to be offended by the same things, for them to simply be carbon copy clones of each other. It's not what the body of Christ is supposed to look like. That's not what a spiritual community is supposed to look like. It's supposed to be diverse. And the weakest among us are the most indispensable to the strongest. So we've got a few questions in those study materials that are online at go.christstable.today/gameon. But every day at the end of the study, I like to put one of those questions up for us to chew on here. And so this is the first question. There are several more in the study, but here's the first question. Who are the pawns, or who are the weaker individuals in your life whose contributions you might be overlooking? Who are those people? I think this is a great question because this invites us to reflect on people who we probably don't usually reflect on. For some of us, it might be a little bit difficult for us to think through who are the weaker individuals who we dispense with, but should perhaps be considered indispensable. Think on that. If you have any answers that you'd like to share with the group, feel free to post those on the comments or the chat wherever you're watching. Always love to see those. Looking forward to being back with you tomorrow as we continue on with the King.